Hello everybody, and welcome back to Nerdy Miniatures, and in today's video we paint our heroes from both sides of the Battle of Edoras starter set. We have 4 figures on foot and 4 on horseback to paint. So we have a lot to cover, so let's not stall any longer and get on with the video. So to begin this video, I took all 8 figures and sprayed them all with grey Seer spray paint. I did 2 coats all over, as these figures had a lot of gaps that I needed to cover. After they'd been left to dry, I started on the figures that were on foot first. To begin this process, I started with the Princes of Rohan, Haleth and Hama. First things first, I used gallum and flesh to coat the skin. I also jumped between the 2 figures multiple times during this process to allow them to dry properly. Starting with Haleth, I began with his tunic. For this, I mixed Mournfang Brown and Rakarth flesh. I painted this over his tunic to create a warm leather colour. Next, I move on to his cape. For this, I laid a base of Militarium Green and a large brush. I did end up going over this in the end with Waagh flesh to create the perfect base, but I did do this off camera. Now that the tunic was dry, I went over it with a light wash of the shade Gorthor Brown. I did this on both Hama and Haleth. Then it was time to do their hair. For this, I used Xandri dust to create the perfect yellow blonde. Next, it was the fun part. It was time to begin building the base for his chainmail. For this, I used Basilicanum Grey, as I lay down a very light wash wherever the chainmail will sit, so that way then it would be ready for a metallic shade later. Moving on to the little details, such as the belt around Haleth's waist. For this, I mixed Mournfang Brown and Corn Red to create the perfect shade before brushing it across the belt. Despite looking good, Haleth was looking a little bit too clean, so it was time to do the dry brush. For this, I used Dryad bark, and I brushed off the excess on a piece of kitchen paper before sweeping it over the figure. Then it was time to jump back into the chainmail. For this, I used the shade Leadbelcher. I brushed a thin layer over the section before using a larger brush to use the same colour to do a clean coat over Haleth's axe. Now it was time to begin highlighting the figure. For this, I used the shade Rakarth Flesh to highlight the straps on Haleth's armour. Whilst that dried, I moved on to his skin. I used Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh to add dimension. For a little bit of shine, and again to make him look a little bit dirty, I used the shade Seraphim Sepia. However, in doing so, I lost some of the red-brown pigment after dry brushing as well, so I mixed some Corn Red with some Gallum and Flesh and used this to highlight his belt once again. For his eyes, I used Vallejo Model Colour in white and Abaddon Black to add the pupils. I did this on every figure. I then dipped into that same white paint and used a small brush, and I used this to highlight his hair. Haleth is standing on a small rock, so for this I used technical paint and I used the shade Astro Granite, and to finish off the rest of his base I used Stirland Mud. I did the same base on every figure. Now that Haleth was done, it was time to move on to Hama. I went ahead and painted Hama's hair and cape off camera, so for this I used the same paints that I had used for Haleth. For his clothing and armour, I started by painting a layer of Basilicanum Grey to create more depth. Hama's armour seems to consist of more chainmail than that of his brother, so unlike Haleth, we used more greys and silvers, whilst hitting the leather parts with the same shades. Once that was dry, I went in with the shade Dryad Bark, and I did a base coat on his quiver, along with the leather cuffs on his arms and legs. I also brushed over the leather plating on his front. To finish off his weapons, I went with the shade Mournfang Brown and painted his bow and arrows. I then went on to start his skin. As I said before, we'd already done a base of Guilliman flesh, so I laid down a very thin coat of Kislev flesh and started adding warmth back into the skin. Now it was time to start dry brushing. For this I used Mournfang Brown. More than anything, this was to add just a little bit of wear and tear to the leather sections of the figure, before moving on to his chainmail. Just like Haleth, I used Leadbelcher and a small brush. I also applied the same colour to the tip of his arrow. Moving back onto the highlights. Just like Haleth, I used Rakarth flesh to highlight the armour plating, added a little bit of a dirty look using Guilliman flesh over the top of it. Off camera, I added white to the eyes and the same black for the pupils, before doing the same base that I did for Haleth on Hama. Now moving on to the Evil campaign's heroes, if you can call them that, or would we call them enemies? Depends which side you're playing. Let's start with Wulf. Once we've painted all figures on foot, we'll paint all of these heroes on horseback. For Wulf, like the others, I painted the skin with Guilliman flesh before leaving it to dry. Wulf's clothing is by far the easiest to do, as his outfit is mostly black, so for this I painted his clothing in Abaddon Black and left it to dry. Using the shade Dryad Bark, I went over Wulf's belt, boots and the sheath of his sword. This isn't extremely noticeable against the black figure, but it's different enough to add a little bit of dimension. Moving on to the metallics, I then went in with Leadbelcher to paint his swords, as well as the top and bottom part of his sword sheath. Overall, this figure is a very cool toned figure, so it relies on the highlights to add the dimension. For this, I added grey Seer and dry brushed it across the front of the figure. For Wulf's hair, I laid a coat of Abaddon Black as the base. Even after dry brushing, the straps across Wulf's chest still needed a little bit more highlighting, so using a small brush, I painted this with a very small layer of grey Seer. Then it was time to move on to his cape. For this, I used Basilicanum Grey and a medium-sized brush. I also used this on Wulf's furs to add a little bit of contrast between his clothes and his cape. Now it was time to add the gold to the straps across Wulf's chest. For this, I used Retributor armour and a small detail brush. I think this really adds dimension to the figure and it brightens him up a lot. To add the dimension to his capes, hair and furs, I once again went in with grey Seer to dry brush this across the back half of the figure. Wulf can be seen standing on a base of rubble and a broken shield. For the shield, I used a light shade of Militarium Green and a delicate hand to give it a light wash of colour. I then went over the remaining shrapnel with Gorthor fur. I filled the centre of the shield with Retributor armour, and off camera I painted the rest of the base. Now moving on to the last of our standing figures, General Targg. This figure is a lot cooler toned in comparison to his Dunlending counterpart, but he looks very cool nonetheless. First things first, I used the shade Apothecary White, which is actually a very light grey, and brushed it over Targg's hair and his furs. Next, I went in with Basilicanum Grey, first on his tunic and later on his cape. I also used the same shade for his boots and legs. Peeking through the centre of Targg's tunic is a small section of blue fabric. To fill this in, I used the shade Stormfiend and a small brush to add that detail. I then went in with the shade Baneblade Brown. I used the shade on the straps around his boots, as well as the ends of his sword sheath that poked out from underneath Targg's cape. Then it came time to dry brush. I used my tried and true grey Seer, and I dry brushed this across the entire outfit. I did this to make the next step look even better. It was time to add the stitching to his armour. For these stitches I used Gorthor Brown, and the smallest brush I own, I swept the smallest amount of colour over the stitches. I did the whites of his eyes, and did the Stirland Mud base off camera. Moving on to our characters on Horseback. As far as the individual characters go, I won't be jumping too much into their colour schemes as they're going to be more or less identical to the walking figures, but I will tell you how I painted the horses, starting with Hama. Before doing the horse's coat, I did his saddle and underclothes. For this, I used a base of Waagh flesh before adding a mix of corn red and dryad bark to the saddle. I used Mournfang brown and a small brush also. Hama's horse is a warm brown colour, so to achieve this, I went back in with the base Mournfang Brown to create a smooth, matte effect all over. For the mane and tail, as well as the fur around her feet, I used the colour Xandri Dust, meaning this horse has the same hair colour as her devoted rider. To add some dimension to her coat, I went in with Kislev flesh, and I dry brushed it across the surface, focusing more on her hooves, as that is where her long fur mostly rests. To do the metal martingales on her body, I used the shade Retributor Armour to fill this in, and I used Dryad Bark for the reins. To finish off Hama's mare, I used Abaddon Black to fill in her eyes and her hooves, and I used Vallejo Modder colour in white to add highlights to her mane. Moving on to Haleth. I started the painting by doing the saddle and the underclothes on the horse again. For this I used Mournfang Brown. I used the same shade on the reins, for going in with 2 coats of Auric Armour Gold on her mantle. In the film she has details of red dragging through the gaps. I decided to leave it with just the gold base instead. Like with Hama, I used the shade Retributor Armour for her martingales, but unlike her mane, Haleth's horse is as blonde as he is in this case, so I used the same coating all over her fur. I started with a thin layer of Kislev flesh, before going back in with Xandri dust. For the mane and the furs around her hooves, I mixed the same shade of Xandri dust with Rakarth flesh to create a slightly cooler blonde tone before applying it to the mane and furs. Haleth's horse has some armour covering the face, so for this I used the shade Ironhand Steel to achieve this look. Like Hama, for the blanket underneath the saddle, I went in with a reddish brown colour, so I mixed Corn Red and Abaddon Black to create a deeper burgundy shade. I used the shade Mournfang Brown to fill in the remaining layers of fabric. Around the saddle is a layer of furs. For this I used the same model colour in white, and I ended up going back over it with the shade Seraphim Sepia, so the overall look of the furs was just too clean for a warhorse. Moving on to Wulf's horse. I coated the entire horse in 2 coats of Basilicanum Grey, as much like his rider, Wulf's horse is as dark as he is. With that in mind, I went on to apply Abaddon Black to his hoofs, his mane and his tail as well. For the martingales and other details, I applied Iron Hand Steel, which really brought out those details and I loved it. Then it was time to start adding highlights. As this horse was so dark, it was important to add light where I could. Covering the horse's face is a covering in an ivory colour and could potentially even be made of bone, but I must say it makes Wulf horse look very cool, so for this I used Rakarth flesh. Moving on to the furs around Wulf's saddle. For this I used Eshin Grey and covered the entire area with it. For the reins I used Dryad bark to create a leather effect. Using the same shade of Eshin Grey, I dry brushed this paint over the mane, tail and furs around the hoofs to add dimension, before adding a light coat of grey Seer over the top using the same method, and also added this to the furs around the saddle. Moving on to the last figure. If you guys are still around, thank you for sticking it out so far. We're in the final stretch now. We are finally moving on to Targg on horseback. Like his rider, his horse is built up of shades of grey, so not too many paints went into making this horse look good. Starting with a base of Eshin grey, I painted the base coat over the entire horse, creating the perfect matte grey colour. For the saddle, I used the shade Dryad Bark, and like Wulf, his horse does not have any grand colour scheme, so keeping the blacks, greys and browns is the way to go. Like Wulf's horse, this war horse also has a mask made of what looks like bone, so off camera I painted this using the shade Rakarth Flesh, before adding some blue markings using Stormfiend, the same shade I'd previously used for Targg's tunic. Unlike his dark exterior though, this horse has locks of light blonde, so to achieve this, I used the shade Oshabdi Bone and brushed it over all the hair that the horse had. I also dry brushed this over the hooves of the horse before adding Abaddon Black to the eyes and the hoofs off camera. And this is it. These heroes took a long time to do. I believe to paint all of these figures it took me about 5 days to complete, and it was a labour of love, but it was worth it in the end, because all 8 ended up looking really good. In the next video, we'll be looking at yet another Warhammer exclusive as we build and paint the Defenders of Lake Town. So if that sounds like something you would be into, then subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that. In the description down below, you'll find 2 links. One to Mr. Nerd's channel, so if you enjoy MMOs and action RPGs, then check that out. If you enjoy all things fantasy lore, then please have a look at my channel, where I cover lore from Tolkien, Game of Thrones, Age of Sigmar, and most recently The Witcher. So if that interests you, then please take a look at that also. Anyway, that'll be it from me today. Hope you guys have a wonderful day or night wherever you are in the world. And as always, peace out.